All right, so are you ready to like dive into this story? It's got all the makings of a good music industry drama, I think. With a messy breakup and a bold claim that has sparked a ton of debate online.
It really does. It's fascinating.
We're going to be unpacking Rotimi's exit from 50 Cent's G-Unit label
Right.
and his claims to be a pioneer of Afrobeats in the U.S.
Yeah, it's interesting how this, goes beyond just like one artist's career moves.
Right.
This is really looking at the evolution of a whole music genre and how music crosses borders and, who gets to claim credit for like a global phenomenon.
For sure. Our sources for this deep dive are 3 articles from the Nigerian press, Daily Post Nigeria, the Whistler newspaper, and the Nation newspaper,
Okay.
all published earlier this month in December 2024.
All right.
And they give us kind of different angles on Rotimi's story, and so we'll see what we can piece together.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting is what this reveals about how cultural trends even take shape, because it's rarely like a straight line,
Right.
from point A to point B.
Totally. So first things first, the breakup.
Okay.
All 3 articles agree that Rotimi says he left G-Unit because of creative differences.
Right.
But it seems like those differences boil down to 50 Cent not really getting the potential of Afrobeats.
Yeah, and it's important to remember the timing here. Rotimi says this happened around 2017, 2018.
Uh-huh.
Well, before Afrobeats hit the mainstream in the US. So 50 Cent was questioning Rotimi's sound, didn't think it would be commercially successful.
I mean, can you imagine as an artist, like being so convinced of your vision,
Right.
but then your label just doesn't see it?
Mm-hmm.
How frustrating would that be?
Incredibly frustrating, I would imagine, yeah.
And Love Rhythm is the song that Rotimi specifically mentions
Okay.
as like a perfect example of that disconnect between him and 50 Cent.
Really highlights the challenges that artists face when the label's vision doesn't align with their own,
Right.
building a successful career in music, often requires more than just talent, but finding the right partners who believe in your artistry and are willing to take those risks.
Absolutely. So Rotimi, feeling stifled and misunderstood, walked away from G-Unit,
Yeah.
landed at Empire, became their first Afrobeats artist.
Wow.
That move alone, I think, speaks volumes about his confidence in the genre's potential.
It's a bold statement for sure, especially given, the industry landscape at that time. But here's where things get even more interesting. He doesn't just leave the label. He jumps right into this debate about his role in Afrobeats history,
Right.
calling himself a pioneer.
And that claim is stirring up a lot of reactions online.
And understandably so, Afrobeats has such a rich and complex history, with roots in various African countries and musical traditions. So the idea of one person claiming a singular pioneering role is bound to, spark some controversy.
Yeah, and to back up his claim, Rotimi talks about touring with Banky W and WizKid back in 2011,
Okay.
hitting up radio stations trying to promote this sound.
Right.
He's saying he was an Afrobeats evangelist, before it was cool.
He specifically mentions using his African-American identity to bridge the gap between the genre and American audiences.
Okay.
So making it relatable to those who might not be familiar with it, but this claim to be this bridge raises interesting questions about, how we understand cultural influence and exchange. Does a genre need to be translated in order to be appreciated by a wider audience?
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it also makes me think about all the artists who were already pushing Afrobeats globally long before it gained traction in the U.S.
Right.
So it's like Rotimi acknowledges that success,
Mm-hmm.
but then he suggests that something was missing,
Interesting.
that he was like the key to unlocking the genre's potential in a new market.
It's a bit of a tricky argument. He's trying to highlight his own contribution while recognizing the work of others who came before him.
Right.
But, it begs the question, was he riding a wave that was already building, or did he actually play a pivotal role in shaping his direction?
And speaking of waves, Rotimi keeps emphasizing those early days when Afrobeats was still under the radar.
Yeah.
Well, there's this little detail in the Whistler newspaper article that kind of throws a wrench into that timeline.
Mm-hmm. What's that?
They mention the tour with Banky W and WizKid happening in 2012,
Oh.
not 2011 like Rotimi claims.
That date discrepancy is definitely worth noting. It might seem like a small detail, but a year can make a big difference.
It's huge.
When you're tracing the trajectory of a musical movement, it also underscores, the importance of scrutinizing sources and considering multiple perspectives when trying to understand a complex story like this. So, dear listener, what do you think, 2011 or 2012, which date feels more accurate, in the context of what we know about Afrobeats' journey?
And even with that inconsistency, you can't deny that he was there in those early days,
For sure.
hustling for a genre that wasn't yet on everyone's radar.
Absolutely. And he even acknowledges the, pivotal moment that Drake and WizKid's One Dance played in catapulting Afrobeats onto the global stage.
Right.
He's not trying to diminish the impact of that song,
Yeah.
but it seems like he's positioning herself as someone who helped lay the groundwork for that breakthrough.
He's basically saying, I was in the trenches, putting in the work even when people weren't paying attention.
Right.
But is that enough to earn him the title of pioneer? Not everyone is buying it.
Yeah, and that's where the real debate begins. The internet loves a good controversy, and the question of who gets to claim credit for a musical movement as big as Afrobeats, is bound to generate strong opinions. Was Rotimi a true trailblazer, or is he really overstating his role?
That is the million-dollar question, one we'll keep exploring as we dig deeper into the story. But before we get there,
Yes.
let's zoom out for a moment and consider the bigger picture. What does Rotimi's story, with all its complexities and contradictions, tell us about the way that cultural trends evolve?
That's precisely where we're headed next.
Okay.
This isn't just about Rotimi. It's about understanding the forces that shape these musical landscapes and the sometimes messy process of how genres gain global recognition.
For sure.
So welcome back to the deep dive. I think it's time we kind of take a step back from the specifics of Rotimi's story and explore the bigger picture of how musical trends, like the Afrobeats wave, really takes shape.
Because this isn't just a story for music nerds, right?
Yeah.
I feel like there's some really universal themes here about timing and influence and how cultures intersect.
Absolutely. Think about what Rotimi said about the music scene, back in the early 2010s.
Yeah.
Afrobeats was already making waves, in other parts of the world, but it hadn't quite caught on in the U.S. yet.
He was getting those skeptical looks from radio DJs right.
Right.
Just pushing this sound that people weren't familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you realize that, the success of a genre depends on more than just the music itself.
For sure, it's about being in the right place at the right time, having the right industry support, and crucially, an audience that's ready to embrace something new.
Totally. It's like all these different pieces have to fall into place.
Yeah.
And then, bam, a song like One Dance explodes. And suddenly everyone's paying attention to Afrobeats.
And it's almost like that song cracked open a door, and then you had this incredible surge of talent and creativity
Right.
pouring through artists who had been working for years, building their fan bases, finally had this wider platform to showcase their music.
But what's so fascinating is that even though a song like One Dance can be that tipping point,
Right.
it's built on a foundation laid by countless artists who came before.
Exactly.
It's not just about one-hit wonder. It's about this whole movement that's been gaining momentum over time.
Yeah, it's about influence. It's about the cross-pollination of musical ideas.
Okay.
And the ways that artists inspire and build upon each other's work.
I like that. And it's worth taking a moment to acknowledge those artists that Rotimi mentioned, Don Jazzy Two-Face, Adibia P-Square.
Right.
And the list goes on. They were all contributing to this evolution of Afrobeats and shaping the sound that would eventually capture global attention.
Absolutely.
But it really makes you question whether it's even fair to talk about a single pioneer
Right.
in a genre as rich and complex as Afrobeats.
Right.
Isn't that always going to be an oversimplification?
That's a fantastic question, and it highlights, I think, a bigger challenge we often face in understanding cultural movements. You know, we have this human tendency to want to pinpoint the one person, the one event that started it all. But the reality is rarely that neat and tidy.
It's like trying to find the source of a river.
Right.
You can trace it back further and further, but there's always these smaller streams and tributaries that fed into it along the way.
Precisely, and I think it's far more interesting and insightful to acknowledge all of those influences.
Yeah.
To appreciate the complex tapestry of a genre rather than trying to force it into a simplified narrative.
So bringing it back to Rotimi, is he being a bit too self-congratulatory when he calls himself a pioneer?
Yeah.
Is he trying to grab more credit than he deserves?
Well, it's certainly possible that his perspective is colored by his own ambitions and his desire to be recognized for his efforts. But even if we take his pioneer claim with a grain of salt, there's something to be said for his passion, for his early advocacy for the genre.
Oh, absolutely. He clearly believes in the music.
Yeah.
And sees himself as playing a part in bridging cultural gaps. You can hear that genuine conviction in his voice.
And that passion, that drive to champion a sound you believe in is incredibly important.
Totally.
It's what pushes artists to take risks, to push boundaries, and to introduce these new ideas to the world.
So even if he wasn't the sole architect of Afrobeats' success in the U.S.,
Yeah.
he was undeniably part of that movement, part of the conversation.
Absolutely. And that in itself is significant.
Right.
It reminds us that cultural change is rarely a solo effort.
Yeah.
It's this collective endeavor, a tapestry woven together by countless individuals with their own stories and contributions.
And isn't that what makes it so exciting? This interplay of influences, this collision of creative energies that ultimately leads to something new and beautiful.
Absolutely. And that's what's so captivating about exploring a genre like Afrobeats. It's a constant process of discovery,
Yeah.
of uncovering new artists and appreciating the rich history and influences that inform the music.
It makes me think about how we experience music as listeners,
Right.
We might hear a song on the radio and fall in love with it without ever knowing the full story of how it came to be.
And there's a real beauty in digging deeper and understanding the context of the history,
Yeah.
the countless individuals who contributed to a genre's evolution.
It's like you're suddenly hearing the music with new ears, appreciating it on a whole other level.
Exactly.
But there's one final layer to this deep dive, one that connects back to Rotimi's story in a surprising way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about Rotimi's exit from G Unit,
Yeah.
his claims of being an Afrobeats pioneer and, like the broader forces that shape musical trends. But it feels like there's one more thread to unravel in this story.
Yeah.
And it touches on something way bigger than just music.
It's interesting, how Rotimi's story kind of intersects with these broader conversations about representation and cultural ownership and, how Black artists navigate a global music industry that hasn't always been welcoming to sounds outside the mainstream.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Like, break it down for me.
So think back to how Rotimi frames his role in promoting Afrobeats.
Okay.
He uses that word bridge, highlighting his African-American identity
Right.
and suggesting that he was able to connect the genre with Western audiences who might not have otherwise been exposed to it.
So he's not just like a performer. He's taking on this role of like cultural ambassador, almost like a translator.
Exactly. And that's where things get really nuanced.
Okay.
On the one hand, you could argue that Rotimi's efforts helped to expand the reach of Afrobeats, introduce it to new ears.
Uh-huh.
But on the other hand, there's a potential for this to be perceived as gatekeeping.
Right.
As if Afrobeats needs this outsider's interpretation to be understood or valued.
It's a delicate balance, right? Like he's clearly proud of his heritage and wants to share it with the world. But is there a risk that his narrative kind of overshadows the voices of the artists who were born and raised within the Afrobeats culture?
Yeah, that's the tension I think a lot of Black artists have to navigate, especially those working in genres with roots in Africa.
Yeah.
It's about honoring your heritage and sharing it authentically,
Right.
while also pushing back against expectations that can limit creative expression.
It's about owning your story, right?
Mhm.
Making sure your voice is heard on your own terms and not letting others define your identity or your art.
Exactly, and that's what makes Rotimi's story resonate so strongly. It goes beyond the music itself,
Yeah.
and it forces us to think about these complexities of cultural exchange, the power dynamics at play, and the importance of amplifying a diverse range of voices within any artistic movement.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? Like, what should they be thinking about as they go about their day, maybe even as they listen to their favorite Afrobeats playlist?
I think the most important thing is to be mindful,
Yeah.
to approach cultural trends with a critical ear and to be aware of the nuances of representation.
Yeah.
Who's being given the microphone, whose stories are being told,
Right.
and whose perspectives might be missing from the conversation.
Those are such crucial questions to ask, and they apply not just to Afrobeats, but to any genre, any cultural movement that catches our attention.
For sure.
It's about looking beyond the surface, beyond the hype, and engaging with the complexities beneath.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that cultural influence is a two-way street,
Right.
a constant exchange of ideas and inspiration.
It's a journey.
And it's a journey of continuous discovery.
So the next time you hear an Afrobeat song,
Mhm.
I hope you'll think about the journey it took to reach your ears, the artists, the producers, the cultural forces that shaped its sound.
And remember, the story of a genre is never truly finished. It's constantly evolving, being rewritten with each new artist, each new song that pushes boundaries and challenges expectations.
And that's the magic of it all, isn't it? The music keeps moving, the conversation keeps going, and we get to be part of that ever-evolving journey.